All right, for the language and computers class, we're going to move on to a new topic, which is speech. And speech is really more basic than written language, but it's also more complex. So we started with the easy, which was a simplification or simplified representation of language in written form. But language is really speech or signs if it's a sign language. So we started with writing, and generally speaking, we are starting with the basic ways at which computers interact with language, and language has to interact with computers. First with writing and reading text, and then speaking or hearing speech. So with that need to interact and process and handle language, computers need some way to represent and store both text and audio. So we are getting ready to talk about language in terms of speaking and hearing it, and then we'll move on in the next unit to how computers represent, store, process, and synthesize speech as audio. So, speech. Well, first of all, it's good to be aware of the fact that not all languages are written. And again, this is an important idea that we often get confused about, that language is not writing and writing is not language. Instead, writing is a representation of a language. And in this world of more than 7,000 languages still in use today, as best as we can estimate, up to nearly half of them do not have a writing system. And the fact of the matter is that some of these communities don't want a writing system. They prefer to stay oral. They know that there is writing. They know you have some awareness through maybe national language and national education of what writing can offer to a community, but they feel that they have higher advantages keeping their language oral. And indeed, there are some advantages that have been discovered or rediscovered really for oral languages. For example, abilities to memorize are much higher, and stories that are passed down orally sometimes it turns out are as accurate and even more accurate historically than written versions. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you're working with communities, and one thing that can motivate why speech technology can be so important. Not all communities will necessarily want or benefit from having a way to write down their language. So here's some examples of languages. Southeastern Pomo, a language native to California. There's only one speaker. That might make sense then why no writing has been developed, is not being developed. But there's larger groups. Salar, a Turkic language spoken in China, 70,000 speakers. That's quite a bit. An American Sign Language in the USA. That's not the same as Signed English. It's a separate language with its own grammar and structure. It has nearly 500,000 speakers. But as of yet, there is no unified or standard way to write it down. And my understanding is that the community doesn't necessarily want, it's one of the communities that doesn't necessarily want to have a written form for various reasons. So speech is extremely important. If we're going to talk about speech, let's think about, what does speech look like? Well, we can think about it like what speech, quote unquote, looks like if we think in terms of writing it down, which we just talked about. There's not writing systems for all languages, but there is a way to transcribe exact speech sounds with the phonetic alphabet, the most common and popular being the IPA, which stands for International Phonetic Alphabet. But this process of transcribing, particularly if you're doing exact speech sounds, is very expensive and time consuming. And we'll see some of the complexities of speech that cause an exact transcription to be expensive and time consuming. But even if you're just writing it down in a less exact way in the language's orthography or writing system, it still is time consuming and expensive to do. So part of the question we might be able to answer or solve with speech technology is automating that transcription. If we can somehow figure out a way to relate an audio recording to a written text in a way that's measurable, and in this context, really measurable means predictable. There's some sort of predictable correspondence between the audio and the text. And then that would be very useful just for the transcription's sake, let alone all the other possible ways you could use speech technology. But to do this, then we have to figure out a way to let the computer know what are the properties of speech sound that are measurable, how to measure those properties in a way that we can relate to the text, And how do all of those, so what are the properties? How do we measure them so we can recognize them? And then how do those measurements of these speech properties correspond to the written text in a predictable way? Okay, so that's what we have to do. And what the rest of this first unit on speech is going to look at really is not a lot of these details, some of these details, but you'll see a lot of details of these properties and of speech. Not that you necessarily need to know them in this class. The bigger purpose here is to just give you a taste of how complex speech is. And so that when we're dealing with computers, you have an idea of the challenge of the task of relating audio recordings or something coming through a microphone to text because of how complex speech is. So we'll get some taste of that complexity and a sense of what that challenge of building speech technology looks like. To start out with, let's think about that. What makes representing speech hard in any sense of the word? Whether with writing, deciding on a writing system, or going into technology. The biggest thing is that people speak the same language differently. Everybody speaks slightly differently. And whereas our brains fill in the gaps and take care of the differences, and we can recognize, oh, that's a different dialect or a different accent, or people with different sized vocal tracts speak differently. Women on average have smaller, men on average have bigger. That makes a difference in your pitch. We learn to ignore the non-meaningful differences, and we don't even necessarily notice them half the time, because the reality is everybody speaks their own, what's called an idiolect. That is it's not a dialect, but it's your version of the language with your own unique ways of speaking. But we don't necessarily notice that unless it's related to a regional or ethnic dialect. But computers do. Computers are dumb. Computers are very precise. Computers see all of those little differences and doesn't have the human brain to filter out, right? If you think about a recording on a microphone, you might be recording a concert and you're holding the phone on your hand and your friends are making noise around you. But when you're listening to the concert, you don't notice that. Your brain is focused on what's important and it hears the singer out there on the stage. But when you take that recording home, all of a sudden you realize that there was all these other noises around you that your brain didn't notice, but your microphone did notice and recorded and sometimes blocked out what you thought you were hearing or what you were hearing, but it didn't know to filter it. You can't do that. So all of these differences are significant to the computer, even though our brain learns to filter them. Another difficulty here is that sounds flow. Uh, they go continuously. Computers can't store every single bit of speech recording. That would just be too big. Sounds are also, as they flow, subject to perception, how you hear them, right? I mean, how we even understand each other differs, right? Even if we say the same thing, let alone the sounds that we hear or think that we hear. And the perception of what is a meaningful difference in a sound, for example, pit and pat, that difference between it and ah, that makes a difference in a word in English, that's just relative to each other. In another language, that difference might not be meaningful. It might not be noticed. But that idea the sounds flow and they're subject to perception and relative to each other rather than being very distinct brings up these other issues that are difficult to determine. Where does one sound end and another begin? There's no clear division. Even experts struggle to know where do we draw a line between the two once you put all the sounds together in a word. And then once you do start to put sounds together in a word, you might pronounce them one way individually. Once you put them in a word, they start to affect the properties of the surrounding sounds, in part because, well, we're kind of lazy. For example, if you just say K, and you pay attention to where your tongue touches when it's pronouncing K, it's pretty much in the back of your mouth. The back of your tongue is touching the top of your mouth pretty quickly. And if you say a word like cuckoo with the oo sound that represented there by the U, it stays back there. But if the next sound following the K is an E sound represented by the I in the brackets there, like um, uh, what's a word that sounds in starts, oh, key, right, like the word key in English that you turn in a lock. If you pay close attention, you'll notice that the K is not pronounced in the same way. Your tongue is actually moved forward when it pronounces the K because the E requires your tongue to be pronounced further forward in the mouth than the oo. And so you move that K forward so your tongue doesn't have quite as far to travel to get to the next sound, E, and pronounce it correctly. And that's a difference. It's a difference that's going to be noticed by a computer. In some languages, that can be the difference between two very different sounds. But in English, that slight movement of your tongue back and forth in that particular context, we don't even notice it. But the computer has to learn that, and it has to learn that in some languages it's significant and in others it's not. And related to that, then, different sounds are not always very different. We think they're different, distinctly different, because our language has trained us to see them as different. But if you pay attention to where they're pronounced or how they're pronounced in the mouth, they're not that far apart. Of course, the mouth is pretty small anyhow. So, for example, the p in pick is similar to the f in fish. If you pay attention, your tongue, uh, where your tongue is placed when you pronounce those two sounds are not that different. You're not using vocal cords in either of those sounds. In English, we think of them as very distinct, different sounds that make the difference between two different words potentially. But in Tagalog, which is a language in Philippines, they are in many contexts the same sounds. They're variations of one sound. So the difference between them doesn't really make the difference between two different words. And so, for example, my Filipino auntie, she often, when she's speaking English, will say something like pish instead of fish or fick instead of pick. Because in her brain, as it was trained to speak that language, did not grow up hearing and making a clear distinction between those two actually rather similar sounds. So then you have different languages with different sounds, or not different sounds but meaningful or not meaningful differences, and then you have people speaking a language that is a non-native language to them and bringing some of the rules of the sounds into the new language, and then they have an accent, and that, but they're speaking the language. So we can understand it, but how do we get the computer to understand the person who's speaking with a foreign accent? So all of these are just some of the things that make representing speech and getting a computer to represent and process speech very difficult.